more was going on. Yes, there was decline, but a lot more was going on during this period than just decline. A lot of structural transformations, and these laid the basis for what Surat was later to become. This is going to be a somewhat academic talk. Not so many stories about the city because I'm talking about such a broad outline of history. I'm going to be talking mainly about major themes in the history, bringing up examples from time to time. I'm going to start with Surat in the 17th century, in the pre-colonial period. This was a period in which Surat was the leading commercial center of India, and perhaps one of the leading commercial centers of the world. I think it rivaled London, which would have been the only city in Europe that would have come close to Surat in its size. It supported a diverse set of merchants, local merchants, Varniyas, and Muslims for the most part, but also a rich range of foreign merchants from Arabia and other parts of the world. It played a critical role in the Indian Ocean economy. Besides linking Surat, besides linking the sea to the Mughal Empire, it played a role in the Hajj to Mecca, and particularly the commerce of the Indian Ocean was significant. There was trade between Surat and the Gulf area to the west, and to Southeast Asia and to the east. There were no doubt a significant number of Europeans in the city who were involved in the trade, but there's a danger in exaggerating the importance of the Europeans in this trade during the 17th century. Surat was also an important banking center at the time, and I want to stress that it was more a commercial center than industrial center. It imported industrial goods from places like Ahmedabad and elsewhere in the interior of India to the city. It was not so much an industrial center at that time. In the 18th century, particularly after 1730, there was a decline of the city somewhat. I don't want to exaggerate that decline. It's usually attributed to the growing importance of the English East India Company and the rise of Bombay. But also important was the political turmoil in the Middle East, the decline of the Indian Ocean trade, and there was a considerable decline in the Mughal Empire itself, which was important to the decline of the city. But instead of focusing on decline, I want to stress the features of the city that continued. Surat remained connected to the Indian Ocean trade during this period. There was a great deal of trade, and there still remained a number of Arab merchants and Muslim merchants from the Gulf area, as well as merchants from other parts of the Indian Ocean present in the city. Again, the trade with the Europeans remained only part of the trade of the city. Surat increasingly became an industrial place because of the security of the interior declined with the advent of banditry in the countryside, the growing power of the Marathas in the countryside. Surti merchants no longer could rely on goods imported from elsewhere in the city. They could not rely on their routes of supply. And increasingly, Surat became a place where lots of industry was located, small-scale producers. So thousands of weavers migrated, for instance, from the city of Ahmedabad and came to live in Surat. So Surat's population, it may have declined in its commercial significance, but its population didn't decline all that strongly. At the end of the 18th century, the population was still around 200,000, which was not much less than it had been earlier. In 1815, the population is recorded as 150,000. Bombay was a bit above 200,000. So they're roughly cities of equal importance at the time. Bombay was much more oriented toward the Europeans. Surat still oriented to the Indian Ocean trade. So that's important. Now let's come to the colonial period itself. There was no doubt, again, a decline in the city's significance, commercial significance. This was due to the continued rise of Bombay as a commercial port. It was due to fires, floods, and earthquakes in Surat. In 1837, there was a fire that basically burned something like 7,000 houses in the city, very significant development. Also, there was ecological change. The Tapi River was silting up. This made it more and more difficult for ships to come up the river to the city. This also contributed to the declining importance of the port. The fact that the city was connected by railroad to Bombay and that Gujarat was connected to Bombay by railroad also contributed to the declining importance. So remember, the city was about 150,000 in 1815. We have a population account in around 1851, I think it was, of 89,000. But when we have the great census, the first great Indian census in 1872, the population was 107,000. So decline certainly is a theme of this period. But despite the fact of decline, there were contributed considerable signs of dynamism in the port and in the city, excuse me. And I have this quote here from the collector of Surat in 1910, which I want to stress because it says a lot about the character of the city. Not only is Surat the world's center for the pearl trade, but it also holds the premier position in all of India for gold and silver wire and tinsel and brocade work, and preeminently for spangles and spirals of silver and silver gilt, which it export to Madras, Delhi, and many other centers. Here is talking about the jewelry industry. The Mohammedan population of Surat is very enterprising in foreign trade. Scarcely a family has not a branch establishment somewhere, from Tibet to South Africa, from Siam to Mombasa. Everywhere the Randar and Surti Boras penetrate and take with them silk and other goods manufactured in Surat. The wire and tinsel industry, as jewelry, employs 10,000 persons, while silk weaving employs another 10,000, and so on. And the main point here is that two main points. One is it's clearly pointing to the continued importance of the Indian Ocean trade. Surti goods were going to the Gulf and elsewhere wherever they were sold in significant quantities. And the continued importance of small industries, small scale industries, I should say, like cloth weaving, jewelry, and pearls. They were not, their total dimensions were actually quite large, 10,000 weavers, silk weavers, 10,000 jewelry workers. This was quite significant at the time. So what were these industries? First, there was cloth weaving, cloth weaving, which was occurring. You can see the loom on the right, a pit loom. This comes from 1873. I don't know that this was Surat. It looks like it could be, given the housing architecture here. So, but there were significant numbers of weavers who were producing goods for the Indian Ocean, things like kinkavs, which is a gold cloth made of jerry and silk, things like mushroom, these are the names of cloth, gaji, gold thread caps, and these were consumed in Persia, Arabia, and other parts of the of the Ottoman Empire. There was a firm around the turn of the 20th century named Sorabji Hurmas Shah Joshi that employed 150 artisan weavers to make goods sold in the Indian Ocean area. There was I interviewed a family called the Velvanwalas, a Khatri family who were making mushroom and other special quality cloths that they designed themselves, and they were making these cloths for Vora merchants who sold them in Aden and Ethiopia. So there was continued importance, I think probably a bit of expansion in cotton weaving in the later 19th century. There was no doubt a decline in the earlier 19th century. There was also a significant amount of a significant growth in the jerry industry. In 1870s, jerry was just Surat was just one of several jerry producing centers, but because of the improved techniques that Surti manufacturers were making, Surat became the dominant jerry producing center in Western India, in fact, in all of India during the time. Again, I don't know that this picture is from Surat explicitly. It was definitely from Western India, but since Surat was the biggest producer of jerry in 1909 when this picture is taken, it is quite possibly from Surat. The key merchants involved in this industry were Varniyas, Kunbis, and Daudi Voras. Most of the laborers were men from the Rana community, which called Golas at the time, who had shifted over from the profession of rice pounding. And many of the Ranas then become merchants and manufacturers later themselves. There are many others who were not involved in making jerry explicitly, but in embroidery and lace products that use jerry in the production of cloth. So jerry was an expanding industry at this time as the market for jerry goods expanded in India as a whole. And whoops, a final industry to mention was the pearl industry. And this is an industry that's really forgotten in Surat's history, but as that quote indicated, Surat was the largest pearl manufacturing location in the world. Most of the world's pearls pass through Surat, at least the pearls destined for a European market. Critical figures among this were Jain merchants who moved from Bombay, particularly after the plague of 1896 to 1897. And the key figure in the industry was Nagin Chand Javarchand, who I'm not sure anyone has heard of, but he was the one who financed the Nagin Chand Javarchand Institute, which is at Chowk today, and has been, I guess, I was looking online and saw that it had been subject to some architectural refurbishment or reconstruction in about a decade ago. The pearl industry draws to a close in 1918, and unfortunately, I don't have any good slides of it. It's so forgotten that I don't know if it's left a photographic record. There must be pictures somewhere. But I was able to reconstruct this history a little bit only through local newspapers. So overall, the point the points that I would like to make about Surat's economic history in the 19th century, which I'm extending up to 1918 actually, was that the Surat was, its economy was largely based among small scale industry. Most of the producers were from artisan castes, and who brought their artisan skills to professions that sometimes were changing in significant ways. There was a growth of a small middle class of people who were involved in professions like education, government work, lawyers, doctors, so on, also clerks. But this was a relatively minor development compared to cities like Ahmedabad, Pune, and Bombay. The middle class in Surat was relatively small. So I've argued that Surat, because of its highly industrial character, had a hyper-industrial character. And this was not sufficient to contribute significantly to urban growth. The factors of decline were as great as the factors promoting growth. So Surat's population grew from only 107,000 in 1872 to 117,000 in 1921. This changes somewhat during the period between 1918 to 1947, which I find a particularly fascinating period that was characterized by the growth of small industries, particularly cloth weaving and jewelry manufacture. And it's again associated with the artisanal communities who are responsible for the transformation to a certain extent of the manufacturing, the character of manufacturing in the city. So how does one account for this expansion of industry and transformation of industry? To a great extent, it's still the same industries, cloth weaving and jewelry manufacture, but their methods of manufacture changed. And why was this the case? One is electricity became available. Surat Electric Company made electricity available in the city, even in the artisanal neighborhoods from the 1920s on. Basically, in this period, I was told that if 5 residents of a street agreed to have to use electricity, the electric company would connect their neighborhoods to the electric supply, which would make possible the powering of machines in people's homes at the time. This is important because up to this point, the main way of providing motive power, non-human power to industry was to build a coal plant, which was very expensive and could not be afforded by these small artisans who were conducting business on a limited scale. So that's the first thing to suggest. The second thing to mention was the availability of used power looms. I want to stress the new technologies. First, improved kinds of hand looms were used. In Surat, they started using the fly shuttle loom, and they also used a pedal loom called the Hattersley loom. This is a picture of that, which was used in industry more generally, but could be used without power in people's homes. And then this loom became transformed to one that could be powered by electricity. But they also started to use looms, used looms from such as Butterworth and Dickinson looms. And basically they purchased these looms, not from the producers directly, the producers of the looms, but from the Bombay and Ahmedabad mills, which were regularly disposing of looms as they purchased new looms themselves. So during the period between 1925 and 1935, a used loom could cost between 150 rupees a loom to 350 rupees a loom. So this was something that some of the local artisans could afford. They couldn't have afforded absolutely new looms, but they could afford used looms. And they put these looms in their homes, and because of their history as artisans, as handloom weavers, they figured out how to make these looms work by tinkering and working with their neighbors and so on. A similar development happened in the jewelry industry. This is from a little bit later, but new processes of gilding silver wire to give it that gold appearance emerged in the 1920s and 1930s as some local merchants and producers, actually a couple traveled to France where they learned these new procedures. So that's another factor in the development of local industry. They also, local manufacturers also began to use new raw materials. This is where viscose and rayon yarn began employed, which were originally imported from Japan and from Europe, and which were much things like art silk yarn, which made the product much cheaper. And there were similar developments in the jewelry industry, where imitation jewelry, and this is actually the manufacture of jewelry, gilding copper wire rather than silver wire during this period to make cheaper forms of jewelry, which were in demand among groups that were becoming upwardly mobile and were trying to use forms of clothing that emulated those of the upper castes and communities. Okay. The other thing to stress is the development of new markets. And these markets were often developed by local merchants and by the manufacturers themselves, who typically did not produce for mass markets. They produced for specialty markets, markets for specific kinds of cloth, particularly silk clothes, and clothes using jewelry, but much more specific products. So, for instance, the Bachkaniwalas, which were a major Khatri firm, started making saris for young girls that were sold in Bengal in order to develop a wider market. And as I mentioned, there was still the continued sale of goods to the Middle East. This is a feature, a particularly important feature here of producing for specialized markets and producing to communities who wanted to emulate the more prosperous groups in society. Now, I think I can do this. Now, I wanted to show you, give you some better visual picture of this. And this is from a movie that was made in the late 80s by the local art silk manufacturers industry. I'm just going to show you about 5 minutes of excerpts from this film. Okay. And I'll try to make this as large as possible.
The handlooms were slightly modified and were converted to power driven. These looms are known as paddle looms. Some families in Surat are still having such paddle looms running with slow speed.
This is the Hattersley loom.
They still produce fabrics made from blends of filament silk or spun silk with cotton or spun viscose yarn. The expansion of industries in Surat is horizontal. This is a typical situation here. Units are small and they are with residential places. That is why, for outsiders, in old city of Surat, every alternate house is a factory. People are inborn artisans. Surti temperament to live and let others to live is known all over the country. Few entrepreneurs engaged in this industry installed the power looms discarded by the cotton mills and started production after certain modifications so as to make them suitable for manufacturing art silk fabrics. With this changeover, the production increased rapidly, the quality improved significantly, physical labor and strains were reduced to some extent, and ultimately resulted in higher earnings for the artisan weavers. In fact, the industry structure resembles to that of the small-scale cottage industry system prevalent in Japan. It is a domestic industry where the few members of the family manage the industry jointly and maintain themselves by installing 8 to 16 power looms. Thus, the power looms are more or less being dispersed into small decentralized units. These units were originally located in the residential houses of the weavers themselves, but with the family size gradually becoming larger, part of them have now established themselves on the periphery of the city. New industrial estates for power looms were sponsored on cooperative basis, where weavers' families now reside at the first floor and run their power looms on the ground floor with the help of some outside weavers. Though development of the industry was slow, till 1944, the industry in Surat has made spectacular progress during.
Okay, I think I'll leave the film there. These are excerpts from a much longer film that I can't show in this lecture, but gives you a very good idea of what the process of change was. That this was mainly developments at first in the artisan neighborhoods. I think those pictures come from either Sagrampura or Salabutpura, and it was only later that they move outside the city. Another point that I'd like to mention is, excuse me, here. Another point that I'd like to mention is the labor arrangement. At first, the owners were mostly all from the local weaving communities. There's one big exception, and that is the role of Dr. Amit Shah, who founded the Garden Silk Mills. But he relied very heavily on skilled cut-free weavers to instruct him in how to do weaving. So it's only a partial exception. Basically, the most successful of these weavers purchased 8, 16, sometimes 32 looms. For some reason, it's multiples of 4 and 8 that are critical in this that I've never quite understood. At first, most of the workers were from the artisan communities as well. As the industry started to expand, cut-free owners hired workers from the depressed communities in Surat, but also from the countryside and from Maharashtra. But it was mostly from Western India. It's only in the 1950s that they start turning to outside the city. So to summarize the developments here in the period between 1918 to 1947, you have considerable expansion of local industry, particularly weaving and jewelry industries. This is mostly due to the entrepreneurship of people from among the artisan communities. You have the formation of an artisan elite that relies on the use of labor from the artisan communities originally, and then increasingly from outside the artisan communities over time. You have some larger karkhanas forming, but when we say larger, at first we're talking about 24, 32 looms, not huge factories. So most of this is happening in smaller units, and you have a much larger number of small workshops with 4 looms, household units, mostly based upon weavers from the cut-free community and others, producing under contract to merchants and larger karkhandars. So this is a very different pattern of industrial development than Ahmedabad and Bombay. You have significant urban growth. So between 1921 and 1951, the city almost doubles in size, but it perpetuates that hyper-industrial character. You don't have the emergence so much of a diverse local economy, so much as an economy based almost entirely on industrial activity. Now, I won't go into detail about this, but do want to stress the main trends over the next few decades. And basically, I've written them out here, but the ones that I want to stress here are the continued expansion of the power karkhanas and the jewelry workshops, with a few larger factories forming, but mostly this is based upon large numbers of small workshops. They move outside the artisanal neighborhoods, certainly to industrial estates like the Udna industrial state. For several decades, they don't challenge the mills, but by the 1980s, they're beginning to move into forms of cloth production the mills were involved in and challenge the mills, and they begin to surpass the mills in the 1990s. And these other changes are happening. Surat starts to expand very rapidly. So sometimes it would double its population in a decade. And by 1981, the population of the city was approaching 1 million. But it retained its distinctive character of a highly industrial place, or hyper-industrial place, as I suggest. But This was a kind of industrialization based upon the multiplication of small units rather than the development of big factories. Now, to conclude, 2 points that I want to make. The first is Surat's growth after independence may seem like a remarkable new development, but I want to stress that it's based upon transformations that were happening during the colonial period. It was built upon already existing structural features, basically the role of small scale industries that grew out of artisanal activity like cloth weaving and jewelry production. And finally, I'd like to make a comment about the contributions a group like the one you're forming here can make. A group like this can not only start to understand the economic and social history of the city, but it could also contribute through advocacy to the development of the economic and social history. For economic and social history, written source materials are limited, and they're often in unusual form. They're the records of particular firms and so on, which may be unusual kinds of documents. But I'd also like to stress the role of oral history, the collection of history from ordinary Surtis who participated in the building of industries and the creation of other economic developments. And so anything a group like this could contribute to collecting these oral histories could be of tremendous value. And I'd certainly be willing, if your group or individuals in your group are interested in talking more about what could be done by a group like yours to promote the history of the city. So with that, I think I was supposed to do 40 minutes, and I think it was just about 40 minutes. Okay.
Thank you, sir. This was so enlightening. Anyone has any questions to ask? I have a couple of questions, but I can go a little bit later. Yeah, Vishal.
Yeah, so sir, you really very first of all, thank you for such a great like whole episode. But in between, you mentioned that we somewhere as a community are lacking behind in getting history forward. Like yes, you were not able to find a slide of few things. So sir, what we can do at present so that this does not have continues further? What we can do as a individual so that history is conserved and taken forward to the more people as a student or as a community itself?
Well, the first of all, I think I think digging around in the city would produce results. Local libraries and even people may have materials in their own homes. And to get at this material, sometimes it might be, to do that might involve running an advertisement or something along these lines, rather than in sort of saying that this group is looking for materials on the city, looking for older books, looking for records of family records and so on. So that's one thing. But I'd also like to stress my point at the end about the collection of oral histories. And I think Saloni was able to get to my name through Chinmay Tumbe at Indian Institute of Management. And he has become a kind of expert on the collection of oral histories, which he's tried to collect in reference to the Indian Institute of Management. And that is something that can be done. And particularly, if a group like this wants to create a local historical society and generate funds. A specialist in oral histories could be hired, and so on. Or people could actually manage, develop the techniques themselves by getting instruction in them from Chiang Mai and from others. The Godrej archives also in Bombay have people who have expertise in this. So I really would advocate this. I really strongly think this is a great potential for an organization like your own, not just to have lectures, but start collecting the history and producing the history itself. Because I've only been able to touch a small portion of it in my own work.
Thank you, Vishal,
Thank you,
for
sir.
asking
Thank you,
such
sir.
a great question. Yeah, we have started doing that, and we have a long way to go. But that's why reaching out to people like you who have already worked on this is such a wonderful experience, and it inspires us to do even more. Anyone else has any other questions? Abhijit sir, why don't you say?
I did see hands, but
Yeah. Hello, sir. Thank you for the fantastic talk. Actually, I'm an architect and interested in the city's history as well. So I was generally working on the architectural built heritage part of the city in my undergrad thesis. So I was working on bungalows, colonial bungalows. So in fact, a lot of these socio-economic layers also were affecting the built form. But I didn't dig deep into the financial aspects or the trade aspects of it so much. So one question I had was during the time of the Mughals and then the colonial time and then the independence, immediately the independence era, were there any policy guidelines or labor laws which could help these people, these community groups or artisan groups to scale up their production and grow their industry? And if there were any guidelines, how were they? How much were they efficient, or how did they impact these businesses?
well, I think there was no planning or any bodies devoted to economic development in the city, and very limited during the colonial period as well. The growth of the city is largely, and the changing character of its economy is largely due to the entrepreneurship of individual merchants and manufacturers. And it's not a development that has happened in any kind of planned way until mostly after independence. One of the things that happens after independence, for instance, is the creation of these industrial estates, like the Udna industrial estate and so on, that permitted industry to move outside of the artisanal neighborhoods. I'm not sure that architectural form is one that has added to the appeal of the city in significant ways, but actually architecturally the way that industry was developing before would be more interesting. I think it'd be very interesting to explore how existing homes were used increasingly for industrial purposes. But there wasn't significant planning during either the pre-colonial or the colonial period. The British become a little bit involved in efforts to help handloom weavers during the 1920s and 30s, introduced things like fly shuttle looms. But interestingly, the British aren't very interested. Once a hand loom weaver converts to becoming a power loom weaver, the British lost interest in them. So, and I think this is largely because they were responding to the criticism of Gandhi and others about how they had ruined the handloom industry of India, but they weren't interested in the power loom industry. So that was all done by local people on their own.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I had a question regarding how were these local artisans managing to get the credits to set up the looms or buying new looms that they need to manufacture?
That's a very interesting question. I think, I guess an important point is that through much of this period, they were getting credit based upon their own resources. They were able to borrow from local banking families and so on, and from other members of their community, but they weren't able to mobilize large resources. That's one reason why they invest in these cheap machines that they can purchase on a used basis, is because they had limited resources themselves. They couldn't expand rapidly. They couldn't get loans from the formal banks and so on. So the finance available for their activity was quite limited, and I think that affects the way that the city developed, the industry developed.
Okay, and I had one more question. That you mentioned that the pearl trade industry, which was like Surat used to be a huge hub for that. Somehow that the records of it has been forgotten. So why do you think is that so?
Well, I think it's so because the industry disappeared after 1918, and it probably was in a healthy condition in Surat only for a few decades. So I think the trace of that industry has largely disappeared. So that's what I would say. Whereas the jewelry industry and cloth weaving continued. So those persisted, but the pearl industry did not persist, and I'm not quite sure where it moved to after World War I.
And how did it came into being in the first place anyway? How did it start?
Well, I don't know exactly how it started. There's evidence of Surti merchants buying pearls in the Indian Ocean. I think it has a lot to do with the Indian Ocean trade, but there are also records of Bombay merchants dealing in pearls coming to Surat after 1896. But I think the Indian Ocean connections of Surat were very important in there. There's someone who's, Vanshika, has had her hand up for quite a while, so
Yeah, sorry,
I think
yeah.
it's hard to notice all the participants. Well, she's muted in some way. No?
Vanshika, yeah, we can't hear you.
You can raise your question in a chat. Because we can't hear you.
Yeah, she's not on mute, but still we can't hear her.
Can you type out your question? Yeah. Abhijit also asked about labor laws. This is actually an issue that was important, is very important to the expansion of the city. Basically, what happened is that many of the, this is mostly post-independence. Labor legislation becomes important mostly after 1947. That's not entirely true, but a great extent, the power loom factories were not exposed to the same labor laws because of the small size that the mills were exposed to. And as a result, they could escape some of the forms of taxation and labor requirements. Requirements, for instance, for the recognition of trade unions and so on. And in fact, there was a significant trade union movement in these small scale units during the 50s and 60s, but it was essentially defeated. And at one point, there was a significant movement. I've forgotten what the, I think it was called the Bagla Satyagraha, that was organized by local leaders. That was organized against what was happening is some of the factory owners were dividing their power loom workshops into smaller units to escape the labor legislation that existed. So basically, labor trade union organizers in Surat organized a satyagraha against this to try to get the labor laws applied to them. And ultimately, I think this movement fails. And basically, trade union legislation does not become applicable that widely to these smaller units. So essentially, one reason why there was such a great expansion of the small scale production was the small scale production was escaping the kind of regulation and trade union legislation that the big mills had to face. So that's a short story, but that's covered in the last chapter of my small town capitalism book. Yeah.
So I'll just try once
Yep.
again.
We got it. I can hear you.
Okay. Great. Okay. So thank you so much for for your presentation, and I have a few questions. Also because my background, I'm academically, I myself have been trained in history as well. And I actually did my master's at Oxford in global history. So I think that places like Surat, which have such a interesting mix of like the local and the global coming together, is really fascinating. So I think the first question that I'd like to ask is, for spaces or cities like Surat, given that so much of their history is anchored in a local past, which is tied to the global past, that in the 19th and 20th century, as we move towards the phase of nation building, and in the case of India, in the 20th century, how do you think, because of the creation of nation states, local histories and their global, or the local and kind of the coming together of the global and the local, how do you think that has fortunately or unfortunately been subsided because of the nation building process itself, where a lot of histories have been geared towards, or just the narrative by the state has been geared towards creating an identity which feeds into the national narrative, so, and how do you think that, like in some cases, in some small ways, we can reclaim local histories from that kind of narrative?
Well, let me take a first, that's a very interesting question. And let me take a stab at probably an idiosyncratic answer to that. And that is, and I think this was kind of embedded in your question, but to a great extent, what strikes me is that the way that Surat expanded, first of all, Surat's economy grew to a great extent independently of the colonial economy. The transformations that I'm talking about, Surat was dependent on providing cloth in the Indian Ocean, providing cloth providing cloth to local consumers. It was basically involved in forms of production that were not so tied in to the colonial economy and were independent of. So it suggests, to a certain extent, forms of dynamism that persisted despite the creation of colonial economies. And to a certain extent, I would say, to some extent, I could say the same thing about the way national planning worked, is that actually national planners, with some exception, would never have anticipated creating the kind of industry that has emerged in Surat. They had a very different idea. Nehru and others had a very different kind of idea about what kind of industry should be formed. Certainly, some of them were very interested in promoting handloom, the handloom industry. Others were interested in promoting large-scale industry. But no one had an idea that actually many of the regulations designed to promote handlooms were taken advantage of by the local power loom owners to escape the kind of regulation, escape the factors that affected the bigger factories. So to a great extent, what strikes me is in fact that the local entrepreneurs, the way they've expanded was due a lot more to their own initiative and their own, in some kinds, resistances against national planning and so on, national ideas of what the economy should look like. So that's the way I would first answer your question, is maybe this is a sign of forms that these big meta-narratives of the global and the national don't always account for the kinds of agency that's happening at the local level. It takes developments in very different directions than it is intended by either colonial authorities or the national authorities.
Another question that I had was that, somebody who is, who's worked in this field for so many decades and, for instance, my little experience during my thesis research, made me realize what a sad state of affairs the Indian archives are in, or just like history recording. And it was unfortunate that though I was looking at the Indian railways in the late 19th century, but I found more material in the British archives than I could find in the national archives here and other spaces. So how do you think, in small ways, how do you think at the city level or in smaller places, the different stakeholders, and in particular, of course, the government, the municipal bodies, etc., can take to easy ways of just greater historical consciousness among citizens and just ensuring, and of course, ensuring that their records are better kept. Now, of course, digitization and that move towards that is one key area, but what else? Because, for instance, at the local level in so many places in India, the documents are literally just they're just lying and they're just getting eroded, and it's really sad because you can't reclaim those. Once they're lost. So
yeah, I guess maybe this is something of a similar answer to this question as the last one, is that to some extent, I would depend more on the initiative of local citizens and so on in forming historical societies, raising money for the creation of libraries and so on. Digitizing certainly is important because of the tendency of documents to deteriorate in the context of you know, the monsoon and so on, and you know, non-air conditioned spaces and so on. But I would really look to the role of individual citizens. And as I said, I mean, I get a sense that there is something of a movement in India now toward the building of more private archives and more, but archives with real professional standards now. I mentioned the IIM archives that is developing there. The Sarabhais in Ahmedabad we're developing archives and hiring an archivist and so on. It's possible that local municipalities would take it up, but it's a little bit I think more direct action is the way I would go. And certainly there have been philanthropists who have funded such efforts. There was the Gujarat Itihas committee. I could dig up that the sponsor of that. It's actually that actually had quite a bit of funds and produced volumes, but I don't think it was involved so much in record keeping. But I think there is this potential for doing that.
Okay.
Saloni, I was wondering, actually a third came to my mind. I was wondering if I can squeeze in one more, if that works.
Maybe we can ask, so Harshita just raised her hand, so maybe she can ask her question and after that we can.
Okay, hi everyone.
Hi.
So the question that I have is a little personal. So like you said that there do not exist many written records on this subject. So I can only imagine how much of a challenging task it must have been. So what motivated you towards researching into textile industry of Surat or Surat at all?
Okay.
What led you to this?
That's a long story. Let me start in the middle of the story. I wrote this book called Rhetoric and Ritual in Colonial India, which was about the politics of the city. Mostly, the economic history was background, but during that study, I began to see, much to my surprise, that Surat was a city of small industries, and so it really grew out of my history, my work on the history of Surat, and I decided my next project would be to look at small industries. My study was not focused on Surat alone, but looked at all of the Bombay presidency. And basically I felt that the small industries of Surat of India have been less studied. Actually, sitting in on this lecture is Tirthankar Roy. I can see his name there as well. He was a pioneer in the study of small industries, and I regard myself as in his school in which he was a key figure. But I thought it would be interesting to go away from. There was a lot of literature on mills and so on, but to understand these small industries which were, as Tirthankar argues in his book, which were actually more important in terms of employment than the larger industries during the colonial period, much more important, and remain more important today. That it was important to study this, but doing so I wasn't led by documents. I was led by questions about the significant economic activity, and then I was forced to try to find materials that will allow me to study, and that took me into oral histories as much as the history of written documents. So.
Thank you.
Hi. If I may ask a question, maybe after Vansika. Hello, can I ask?
Yes. Yep.
Vanshika, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
So, okay. So I can come in after Vansika.
Yeah. So I also wanted to know, your view on how history can just, can be really made, ways in which it can be made more of a mass movement, and I ask that because, I think I really think history, as I said, is truly the mother of all, is the mother of all, the humanities, because you read so much about the political, the economic, and social, but I think unfortunately in a country like India, it's still a relatively sidelined, and I realized that so much amazing scholarship that's there, gets exposed only to people who undertake, go ahead and maybe undertake a master's or PhD degree. And therefore, the need to kind of bring history, more popular history, is probably the need of the hour. Having said that, I know a lot of professors and academicians aren't the biggest fans of more massy popular history, which can be consumed by a larger audience. But that definitely is one key way in mainstreaming the discipline. The other is, of course, things like like lived experiences through museums, so on and so forth. And as you mentioned, like the culture of archives and preserving such spaces. What other ways do you think that communities like ours, and you mentioned a great example of how if we could run advertisements and try to collect stories and artifacts that link to local histories. What other ways do you think that we individually and collectively, as a community such as Global Shapers, could do something to link, because we have 400 hubs globally, right? We could link maybe Surat with Delhi to, to London, to somewhere else. And I think such a project doesn't even exist, right, Saloni? So we could really think of something pretty cool here. And I think it would be lovely to have some of your ideas, and maybe we could engage with you, continue engaging with you on this front.
Well, I would say I'm less of an expert on those issues than others. So I, just things that occur to me. It seems to me, first of all, that I feel from my experience that there is a growing interest in history, and I particularly sense it in Bombay, where I think a market for academic books and non-academic history books has been created. Some of this movement, some of this interest grew out of the interest in the preservation of architecture and the mills in the 1990s, as local citizens became concerned about the transformations that were happening in the built environment. So I think there was a specific reason, maybe specific to Bombay, because that happened. But there more of a book market became created, and so on. There was more of that interest. I would say the creation of museums is a very interesting idea. One has to get philanthropists involved for this sort of thing. But I think if you have my suspicion is if you had museums, you might be able to get school groups to come through and sort of looking for hands-on kind of activities to learn about the history of their city and so on. So that's one channel that I would suggest. But it does depend a bit on funding to a certain extent. And local people who are interested in the history of the city. Yeah, I think it was, I'm trying to remember the name of the society. It was Gujarat Itihas Vardhak, I think, Samiti, something like that. So, but I have one of their books in another room here. But the key figure now I think has passed away in that group. But there are people who are doing history whom you can rely on for expertise.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. Yeah.
Hello, Professor Haynes. My name is Murari Jha. I teach history here at Ahmedabad University. It's a challenge actually to ask a good question where you have two giants sitting in the room, Professor Tirthankar Roy and Professor Douglas Haynes on Western India and artisans and weavers. And so, but my curiosity is that, and as you mentioned actually in the talk, so the artisans and weavers in Surat were supplying to different markets in the Gulf, to Ottoman Empire, and also as Pedro Machado also has covered that, textiles were going increasingly to Portuguese control areas in East Africa and elsewhere. So again, trying to see the connections that Surat maintained to other areas in Western Indian Ocean, whether is it possible to see the vibrancy of the economic performance of city in terms of ebbs and flows that went in connecting the city to those economies to where it was supplying primarily. If those goods were intended to those markets outside India for consumption, East Africa, Gulf, etc. And I was wondering whether is it? I mean, I hope you've done it somewhere. Like, is it possible to see the total capital employed by those merchants, maybe through customs records or some other records of the colonial period, and to see to what extent that money is expanding or contracting, say in the 19th and 20th century. Another question is related to labor, which is, again, we see this fluctuation in the number of demographic numbers that we have. Recent years have shown that weavers from Eastern India are coming to Surat, say the eastern districts of Bhagalpur and probably Bengal and other areas. So
Orissa, particularly Orissa.
Yeah. So whether I don't know whether this is a new pattern or there is some historical antecedent to this in some other form. So this is just
okay. Well, on the first one, Tirthankar actually would probably be better than me for answering that question. What could be revealed by the customs records? It's not something I've thought about so much because I've always been kind of an urban historian. So I don't know, Tirthankar, do you have anything to say about that? Maybe he's away from his.
No, I'm here. I've been throughout following the discussion. I'm enjoying it very much. So thank you very much for a great talk, and also everyone else who asked questions. Offhand, no. I mean, I have not used those records, and I'm sure that there is something potentially useful there, but it will require quite a bit of effort in processing that kind of record. But I think the discussion, one larger point that came up in many of your comments is this, collecting, preserving oral history. That was, I thought, that was a great idea, of course, but it's also very difficult because you cannot just interview someone without a subject in mind. And often the oral history records really work when you have a project in mind, and then you can target the people. But having said that, there is a lot of, especially small-scale industry enterprise, is not registered anywhere. It's really registered in the family's memory, and the family's memory contains enormous amount of information which tend to get overlooked. So it's a really great suggestion. This is not strictly a response to Murari. I'm sorry, apologies, but I thought since I have a chance to speak, I'll speak. But,
sorry.
But the other very quick point I want to make is that when I was doing research on these subjects, I found that the universities, master's dissertations, MPhil dissertations, which kind of lie unused by future generations, are often a great resource, because these are, especially the history department dissertations, tend to have quite a few really good studies on local enterprise or local history. And there has never been a proper inventory of what exists where. Even the universities don't create or maintain inventory or a good bibliography. So that is something that could be done very easily, just to make a list of what exists in terms of local history, especially economic history, in local universities. And okay. Sorry, Murari, that's totally off the subject.
Nice to see you.
Now, on labor, well, let me say what I think was going on with recruitment outside of Surat. I guess part of my answer to the question would be to say, as historians, we don't really, I don't really know that much about the process that this began with, but it's clear that that the migrants to Surat came from very specific areas, and how those particular chains of transmission began would be worth examining. The particular histories of relations between, say, Surat and Orissa, for example. I think it's basically something that starts in the 50s, 1950s. I could say why it happens, and that is because as local industry was expanding, there's an increased demand for labor, and on the one hand, and the other hand is that the local artisans who had been providing labor in the 30s and 40s are starting to launch off on their own, to create small workshops on their own. So they're no longer so accessible as forms of labor themselves. And they often do this with the support of their previous bosses, who provide them some cases with a bit of capital and so on to start up their own production. And sometimes with the expectation that they will sell cloth to the larger Karkandar involved. So so there's a need to reach outside the artisan communities increasingly. But why they choose the particular areas that they do, I can't say. I should also introduce, since mentioning Tirthankar Roy, that Professor Ghanshyam Shah, who was the director of the Center for Social Studies, is also listening in. In Surat, he was for several decades, and he is the key figure, really, in the sociology and political science of Gujarat, and had a particular interest in South Gujarat. So I think he's there. I'm not sure he's listening in at the moment. He was there earlier. I saw his face earlier, but it looks like he's got two windows. But he's been there, and also earlier Sujata Patel was here. She is definitely signed off. But she wrote extensively on the Ahmedabad mills, as well as many other subjects, and one of India's leading sociologists. So we have one of India's leading political scientists and one of the leading sociologists have been here. I guess Ghanshyam is. Ghanshyam, are you there? No, I guess he's moved away from his microphone, but it's not just Professor Roy, but and these are people who, I think, who have connections to. Ghanshyam has very strong connections to Surat specifically, and both of them strong connections to Gujarat. So. Ghanshyam is in Ahmedabad, so.
Thank you for joining Tirthankar sir and Murari sir and Ghanshyam sir as well, even though not there. So this was a very, very enlightening talk, Mr. Haynes, Professor Haynes. And I hope that whatever you asked, like whatever you said, the points you raised about people, local people putting on efforts to raise awareness about the history, about the local heritage. This platform is just a very humble way to at least start doing that. How it came into existence is only because, like you only said, that the first step is to start digging into your city's history. And that's what I started doing. And I fell into a rabbit hole, like Alice in a Wonderland. So, and it's still been, I've been exploring a lot of new things, and every time it is something new, something astonishing. And this lecture today was something similar to me, and I hope to all of you as well. So with that, I think we have already overshot half an hour. I'm so sorry.
That's no problem.
So if anyone has any questions, then we can maybe, if not, then we can maybe end the meeting.
I would just make one more point about oral histories. I think oral histories that are conducted by scholars generally are addressing a particular problem, and the scholar has a particular issues that he wants to explore. Oral histories at the local level might also be prompted by people who are interested in promoting a sense of pride in local business and so on, who can promote the history of local families. So that's where I think there's a potential for getting philanthropists involved that may not be coming from an academic perspective, but can end up producing information that is valuable both to academics and non-academics. So I see multiple ways to approach this. I don't know it usually has to do with particular families that where these efforts get going. But they're usually the energy behind these efforts is usually a bit different than the energy behind academic studies, I think. Sorry. You intended to conclude, and I ended up bringing it.
No, sir. I don't intend to conclude. I would ideally like it to go on, but but I think now even I'm sure you also have other further things to do. So thank you for joining.
Saloni,
yes?
I'm just jumping in, but I'm too I just thought, you know, this, it would be great to share this thought. And you know, we've had this conversation before today's episode, and I think today's episode is a great example that if we can think through as a community, you know, and really try and leverage the fact that we have 400 hubs across different continents, I think the Once Upon a Time series concept is great. I think it, and based on what Professor Haynes has said, and you know, again, wonderful to have you, Sir, Professor Roy. I mentioned earlier that actually my background is in global history, and I remember while applying for my course, for my master's, of course, LSC and the Global Economic History program was the other course that I had applied for, and I've read your work and deeply engaged with the entire deindustrialization debate. So thank you for joining us. I just to come back to what I was saying is that I think the fact that we have such senior people who've given their time, I think, Saloni, this should probably encourage us to consider starting a series. We were thinking of doing a national series. I think why not consider a global series, and we can put it out there to hubs across. We can start off with few pilots in India, and then we could put it out there to hubs across different countries that are interested to explore their local histories through a dialogue like this, a Once Upon a Time series. And it could even lead to something interesting as maybe virtual museum pop-ups or something. We can explore that. But I think it would be something really cool, even if we have maybe 15 to 20 hubs on board. I think scholars who are based in different academic institutions worldwide, it would really be amazing to have them. And I think the concept of having a global shapers community which has local hubs can really be channelized here for the cause of pushing more historical consciousness among younger people.
I would suggest, as this will be my final suggestion, that one thing you could do actually is invite an elderly participant in Surat's business history to talk about his career and so on, as a way of breaking into the community and breaking outside the bounds of academia. So that would also be a global shapers, but someone who could talk about his own career, but also about what he sees as larger changes in the city. So. It might be interesting to try to invite Ghanshyam as well to talk about what changes he's seen in the city.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask that, but unfortunately he's not here.
Yeah. So.
Okay. So thank you all for joining. We will end the meeting now. Really, really grateful to each one of you. We will come back again with another episode in month of November. We have the author of Surat, Fall of a Poet and Rise of a Prince, written by Mr. Moin Mir. and he will be joining us to talk about a Nawab who beat East India Company in their own country. So that would be interesting. Okay, thank you all. Good night and good morning to Mr. Haynes.
Okay, yep.
Bye.
Day is only beginning. Okay, thank you all. I greatly enjoyed it.
Thank you.